Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, more on the banks. Is Washington engaging in some British bank bashing to protect New York's dominance? Or is it a crusade to regulate where Britain has failed? Also, Egypt against a tough economic climate post-revolution. There is work to be found. And we check in with Starwood, the name behind some of the biggest hotel brands in the world, and its CEO, Frits van Paschen. But first up, Banking Part 2. Hopefully you saw our special show last week on the poor state of the banking sector and the arguably flawed system under which it operates. Well, this week there's been more banking news, bad banking news that kind of fell into our laps, which actually highlighted an interesting trend. US regulators leading the charge in bringing international banks to book, particularly the UK ones. The latest is Britain's Standard Chartered, accused by the New York State Department of Financial Services of hiding $250 billion in transactions with Iran. And we'll have more details on that in a moment. First, just some background on Standard Chartered itself. No slouch of an institution either when we're talking scale. Revenues of around $16.6 billion last year, which contributes to it being the 13th largest company with its primary listing on the London Stock Exchange. One of the reasons, though, it stayed out of the headlines so far in this financial crisis is that, despite its London headquarters, 90% of Standard Chartered's money comes from Asia, Africa and the Middle East. So that's the bank. Here's the scandal. Peter Sharp brings us up to speed with that.
The US regulators didn't pull their punches. Standard Chartered was a rogue institution that put profits ahead of global security. They said that the bank, with its 1,700 branches in more than 70 countries, hid $250 billion in transactions tied to Iran. The regulators said Standard Chartered's flagrantly deceptive actions had left the US vulnerable to terrorists, weapons dealers, drug kingpins and corrupt regimes.
The US authorities said that in its evident zeal to make millions of dollars, the bank falsified records, failed to keep accurate books, obstructed the authorities and committed what it called willful violations of law.
The authorities said Standard Chartered worked with 3 Iranian banks, suspected of being used by Tehran to fund its extensive weapons program. The Standard Chartered group denied all allegations.
The bank does not believe that the order presents a full and accurate picture of the facts. Throughout the period, the group acted to comply and overwhelmingly did comply with US sanctions. As we have disclosed to the authorities, 99.9% of the transactions relating to Iran complied with regulations. The group's review of its Iranian payments also did not identify a single payment on behalf of any party that was designated by the US government as a terrorist organisation.
I think Standard Chartered would probably make sure that actually they had the evidence in place before they made such a very strong rebuff of the regulators' comments, but this will no doubt play out in the next few weeks as the evidence is presented. This is about interpretation. The Americans are saying you broke the rules, and Standard Chartered is saying, well, under your interpretation, actually, no, we didn't break the rules.
Despite the bank's forthright denial, shares of Standard Chartered have tumbled following the allegations it schemed with Iran to launder money.
So what we have here is a situation where a bank's accused of not complying with US sanctions. It's a straight legal issue. But is it also part of some wider protectionist move, shall we say, by Washington to secure New York's position as the centre of Western capitalism? In the last few years, HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds, they've all paid out hefty fines, so we're considering if there's possibly a pattern here, especially when you take into account that the US Justice Department's decided not to pursue criminal charges against Goldman Sachs for its part in the financial crisis. Let's discuss it all with Angus Campbell. He is Head of Market Analysis at London Capital Group. Angus, do you think this theory holds some water? The idea that US regulators are perhaps not ganging up on British banks, but are at least making an example of them in some sort of, quest for North Atlantic dominance?
There are a number of not just British banks that they have targeted and fined as a result of either money laundering or various sort of things that the regulators have fined them for. And those banks are ABN AMRO before being taken over, Credit Suisse, ING, those are all European banks. Other UK banks that have been singled out, Barclays, Lloyds, HSBC more recently, and now Standard Chartered. So this has been going on for a number of years. But of course, it would feel to British banks, British CEOs, British investors that the British banks are being singled out somewhat because they seem to be the ones targeted more so. I would say that this is more anti-Iran rhetoric and action than necessarily anti-British banks. But of course, you can't help but think that the US as a financial centre or New York in particular, can potentially feel a little bit under threat from the City of London as a financial centre, and so you can't help but think, well, maybe there's an ulterior motive to this action.
Bottom line, though, I think, is that in this case the regulators are doing their job. As I said before, this was a law in the United States. There are sanctions against Iran, therefore the regulator is simply going by the book. And you could argue more widely, regulators there are perhaps picking up the slack of the British or the European regulators.
Well, that's what regulators have to do, you're absolutely right. But I think that also regulators probably have to be a little bit more diplomatic than compared to the way they have acted in this instance against Standard Chartered, because our very own central banker Mervyn King yesterday was saying how it would have been nice maybe if they had perhaps spoken to him. And also you've got institutions, you've got the US Treasury in the US saying, this is a bit of a bolt out of the blue for us too. So usually you would expect the regulators to perhaps collaborate a little bit more with the banks or other central banks within or regulators within the jurisdictions that those banks come from.
But Angus, hasn't regulation in London actually been a bit of a failure, or missed the boat at the very least? The days of sort of hands-off regulation under the last government results long-term in things like the LIBOR scandal. It wasn't regulated tightly, the banks got away.
Yeah, there's no question that regulation needs to be improved, and you're seeing that slowly but surely, but you don't want it to be burdensome. And there are lots of issues that are coming to the fore now. Regulators are trying to sort of flex their muscles because they don't want to be blamed for having the fingers pointed at them for any other potential crises that come around the corner. And let's face it, the banking sector, particularly in Europe, is still pretty much on life support. I mean, it's a very, very fragile sector at the moment. If the Eurozone was to break up, then we could be very, very much looking at another banking crisis. So you have to have the rough with the smooth. The regulators need to be seen to be tough, but at the same time, they don't want to be overly burdensome.
Angus Campbell from London Capital Group. Thanks for your time, Angus. We've looked at Egypt a lot here on Counting the Cost as it tries to repair its economy post last year's revolution. Since then, foreign investors have been fleeing the country. There's this continuing threat of currency devaluation, and the bulk of Egypt's foreign currency reserves have depleted too. But out of crisis comes opportunity, right? Rawya Rageh is in Cairo for us to explain more. Rawya.
Well, Kamal, talk to anyone and they would tell you the Egyptian economy has essentially been on life support since the revolution. Just last month, foreign reserves took a deep dip, falling to 14.4 billion US dollars compared to 15.5 in June. Now, heavy intervention from the central bank has helped the Egyptian pound limp along with just a 5% drop against the US dollar since the revolution, but experts believe a devaluation is inevitable. Yet, despite such a bad climate, some sectors of the economy are actually taking off. Rida Sabit is one of 600 people employed by the innovative startup Mashawir. Arabic for errands, Mashawir is a personal service company that does everything from shopping and delivering, paying bills, and taking your pet to the vet. Launched in Cairo at the height of street battles last year by a group of partners in their 20s, today Mashawir is being acquired after its capital went from $5,000 to $2.5 million.
It was a risk, but all the partners, everyone had the same belief that this could be a hit and that this is our year.
Despite the economic turmoil in Egypt since the revolution, hundreds of young entrepreneurs have bucked the trend. As foreign investors fled, small businesses flourished. In the trendy Zamalek neighborhood, dozens of new restaurants recently sprung up. Omar Diwi, who opened 3 outlets in the past 3 months, says the bad economy actually helped young investors.
Rents or locations were available where they wouldn't have been before in a thriving economy. And that whole concept of let's work now when everyone's asleep and let's try and do something when everyone's down.
At the heart of the business concept of these new ventures is an emphasis on quality and packaging. Take Cairo Kitchen, for example. It serves some of Egypt's most traditional dishes, but in a very different setting and for a very different type of client. Catering to middle, upper and upper classes, clients at these eateries have other concerns than your typical Egyptian. Still, it's not an easy ride for these young entrepreneurs who aren't given privileges reserved to larger enterprises.
They're totally on their own. They need everything from financing to education to support to grace periods on taxes, so on and so forth.
Elements of success that could turn these startups into a real solution to Egypt's unemployment problem. Now, Kamal, there are always concerns about the sustainability of startups, but experts believe that the majority of these initiatives, these startups, should be able to do well, given the fact that even in the most stressed of financial times, people do not stop consuming. And this is a country that consumes a lot of goods and services. In fact, consumption makes up 80% of the Egyptian GDP, a golden opportunity really for these young entrepreneurs, as long as they continue catering to that sector of the society whose wealth, whose income has not significantly eroded and has not been affected to the extent where they would stop consuming these services and goods that they view as essential.
Great stuff there from Rawya Rageh in Cairo. Thank you, Rawya. So there is a new president and cabinet in place in Egypt, so we're going to get an economics health check with Saeed Hirsch. He is Capital Economics Middle East economist. Joining us from London this week. Saeed, thank you for your time. There are any number of negatives we could look at with Egypt at the moment, but we've just seen in our report some of the positives, the young people spotting the gaps in the market after the revolution and making a go of them. Where else do you think are the opportunities in Egypt?
Well, I think, as you said, we can go on forever about the negatives of Egypt's economy as it stands at the moment. But definitely that does create opportunity. Egypt is a very young nation, and there definitely some kind of boost over the events that happened over the past 18 months or so. So I would imagine within the next few months, with the actual crisis, economic crisis, rents and other sides of business costs could fall, wages could fall, which for very entrepreneurial and creative people that could definitely create opportunity. And this is partly why we still see, despite all the difficulties and the problems in Egypt in the, let's say, the next 2 to 3 years or the immediate term, there's definitely a lot of scope for significant boost to growth in the longer term in Egypt.
Where should the government actually focus? It's easy to point to things in Egypt like the tourism industry. You know, we focused on that on this program a few weeks ago, looking at perhaps the sector picking up there. But what other sectors are going to provide the jobs for all these people in Egypt?
Well, I mean, the first job really for the government before looking at the sectors will be to get some kind of macroeconomic stability in place. And it has 2 problems from that end. One, it's Egypt's balance of payments, and one, it's its own fiscal deficit. So the balance of payment has to stabilize. People have to know where the Egyptian pound is going. Currently, the situation is just a lot of uncertainty, which makes it very difficult for investors, foreign and domestic, to actually decide how to make investment decisions, how to start companies that create jobs. And at the same time, the government, with its fiscal deficit, doesn't really have much to actually to try to boost the economy, whether it does infrastructure programs, which could actually create immediate jobs, or other types of investments. that could get the economy moving a bit, its hands are very tied. It can't really change its fortunes as things stand at the moment.
You mentioned the Egyptian pound in that answer, and Rawya, our correspondent earlier, mentioned also how the pound has actually only fallen 5% against the US dollar since the revolution, and yet we also hear about continued pressure on the currency. Hasn't it actually held up quite well in the end?
Absolutely, and it held up quite well because the central bank essentially exhausted most of its foreign currency reserves to ensure that the pound doesn't collapse. We think a devaluation in an orderly way is not necessarily bad. You mentioned the costs for new Egyptian entrepreneurs, business costs. A devaluation currently, since the pound is overvalued, some kind of orderly devaluation, let's say by 10 to 20%, would actually could actually boost the competitiveness, say, of Egyptian exports.
So all these things we've discussed, all these things which need to happen for Egypt's economy to get back on its feet, do you feel the government has demonstrated that it truly recognises the problems and that it has a plan to fix them? I know it's early days for President Morsi, but he's got to have a plan.
Yes, I think that's what is the awkward thing about this government is that it's very unclear what kind of policies and reforms. And I'm not saying just because of the government and its ministers in place. It's also because of the powers that government actually has. So one thing is the government being a technocratic government, full of bureaucrats who actually managed the senior posts in the civil service in Egypt for many years. These people can manage the day-to-day running of government. They understand how the Egyptian bureaucracy works, and that is stable from that end. But Egypt needs some kind of radical change. It needs to actually reform that bureaucracy, not continue on the same in the same way. Going again, I think it's anchoring all of this against these new entrepreneurs, these new investors that could come out and actually take Egypt forward. These people need change. They need less bureaucracy. They need less corruption. They need a much freer market economy for them to thrive in. And this is where I think the current government is a negative, because it is, these people, it's unclear whether they actually can come in and do these radical changes that many people would like to see in Egypt.
All right, Saeed Hirsch there from Capital Economics in London. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Finally this week, it is holiday season, of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, which means, in theory, good times for the hospitality business. But does anyone in Europe actually have the money to be splashing out on fancy hotels? Will anyone come to the Middle East when it's pushing 50 degrees outside? Just some of the theories I put to Fritz van Paschen not long ago. He is the CEO of Starwood Hotels, and if the name Starwood doesn't ring any bells, well, try Sheraton or W or Westin or St Regis, because they're all the big names under the Starwood umbrella. And their boss had come to Doha for the opening of a new St Regis. I wanted to start, if I could, with a quote from you about 7 days ago. I always like to quote people back to themselves. When you said you feel we're on the cusp of a golden age of luxury hotels and luxury style. I can't argue with you here, but really a place like the Middle East, a place like Doha, that's really surely got to be one of the only places you can really do that now, where the money is, where the demand is.
Well, actually what we're seeing is growth in luxury demand around the world. So certainly as you look at Asia, in resort locations, but also in cities, that's true. Our luxury hotels in North America, particularly because supply is already tight, doing very well. Yeah. So the growth in demand is really global, and I think, if anything, why we believe we're on the cusp of this golden age in luxury travel is absolutely because it is such a global phenomenon.
Even in, well, what about Europe? Surely not in Europe.
Well, this is the interesting thing. No one's going to build another Rome or London or Paris. And so the appeal of those locations, when you think about Chinese travelers, travelers from the Middle East, North America, Latin America, those are still great source markets. A luxury hotel in Europe in the right location is performing well today and will continue to do so even if we go through some more difficult times there.
Okay, so let's say that I am a customer who's just walked into St Regis Doha. I could have walked into the Intercontinental right there. It's walking distance there. Ritz-Carlton, Grand Hyatt, 2 minutes up the road. Your own W Hotel, 2 minutes down the road. It's very concentrated here. Why should I come here? And I'm not asking you to sell the place, I'm telling you what is actually different, what is actually making this worthwhile to come here.
What we look at making sure we can do is having a portfolio of brands. So my hope is if you walked into the W, you would have a very different sense of the vibe, the culture, the sense of design than you would coming into here. Our goal with the St. Regis Hotel, whether it's here in Doha or anywhere else, is to respect tradition, to translate it into today, but also to give a sense of place. And that's what we strive to do every time we open a St. Regis. The other piece is...
Are you going to make my life easier? Sorry, you're going to make my life easier coming in here, because I hate coming into a hotel, waiting to be checked in, bags go missing, car gets ages to taken away. Those, I honestly think those would be the important things for a person wanting to come to a hotel. Just make it easy.
Service is always important, and you asked me not to sell, but if I could say this, the signature butler service that you have in a St. Regis, where you have someone thinking about your needs, knowing what you want, is critical. We can build great hotels, we can have a great reservation system, but it all comes down to our associates and the service they deliver every day to each of our guests.
You've got, as you say, a portfolio. You've got the W Hotel here, first W in the Middle East. You've got, and we've got that picture, that amazing picture I'm sure you've seen of the Sheraton Hotel when it was built all those years ago, just that one pyramid and a couple of other buildings and a road and nothing else. In hindsight, a very important move to, as you say, you're not going to build another Rome or a London, but you could build a Doha.
And it's being built today. I think for us, having been here for 30 years, gives us a real advantage. It means we have the right relationships, we know how to get things done here, we have a reputation, and it gives us a platform to build and add other great hotels. It's been true here in Doha, but that's something we've seen play out in China, in Latin America, and other markets around the world that are growing so quickly today.
I was going to say, emerging markets have got to be important to you then, right?
Yeah, I'm almost not sure we should be calling these markets emerging anymore. I think they've emerged. Yeah. They're the fast-growing markets.
What would you call, okay, fast-growing.
Yeah, fast-growing and mature is more and more the way I'm thinking about this. So, because in the mature markets, with no new supply being added, you have a very different dynamic. Actually, from a hotelier's perspective, very positive. But the real growth in terms of new hotels, 70–80% of the hotels we're going to open are in those fast-growing markets.
Of course. Shall we have a look around?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you open a brand new hotel, and as I pointed out, there's plenty of other ones, and there's a World Cup here in 10 years' time or so. Oversupply? Are you worried about being crowded out of the market?
I'm not, and here's a few things I think to think about. When we open a hotel, we open it with an eye towards the next 20, 30, or 40 years. And this is the moment where development is happening. Now, in the near term, when a market is growing this fast, will there be fits and starts in terms of supply and demand? Absolutely. Over the long term, am I concerned about it? Absolutely not. Qatar in this region is on a crossroads. It's a place where people will continue to come to with the addition of a new airport, with the continued introduction of new events. This will be a place that will continue to be a destination so that over the long term, the supply that's being added, if you have the right hotels and the right brands, I think will perform very well.
And if we widen that further, we've been talking about the Gulf, I guess, here, but wider Middle East, starward going into Iraq, which is obviously good for you, but it's brilliant for the country to get that sort of endorsement, if I can say.
We're very excited about the opportunity to go back to the country. So particularly given the fact that travel and tourism is such a vehicle for development, that by itself is a good thing, but also because of the demand that we see already building, it's very important for us to be there.
Tell me about some of the established places as well, because we've been focusing on the growth markets as we term them, but I mean, how's business in Europe? I mean, the fact is things have not improved there. Some countries have gone back into recession. I'm willing to bet that people don't have the money for a stay in a luxury hotel at the moment.
One of the really interesting things about Europe today is that occupancies are at levels where rates typically go up. We're at 70% or better, and in the key gateway cities, midweek, we're full. And so despite the fact that the economy is slow, that we continue to hear news about the euro and the Eurozone, the actual demand for high-end hotels in Europe is pretty strong.
Why?
I think for a few reasons. One, people always want to come to Europe, so there's a great amount of tourism demand in. The second is that while Europe overall has some issues, there are some very strong companies in Europe that are continuing to look at opportunities. So those things are continuing to generate traffic.
Right, so you are fortunate to be in the business of worrying about the incomings rather than what's there at the moment, which is struggling, quite frankly.
Right, and I think the key here is to remember this is all about supply and demand. Nobody's building new hotels in Europe today, and yet the number of people who want to come and see London, Paris, Rome, Madrid is still very high. In fact, the hotels that we own right now are getting significant investments from us to renovate and build out, because we think the future is still very bright for luxury hotels in great destinations in Europe.
Fritz van Paschen, pleasure talking to you.
Good to see you. Thank you so much.
And that is where we'll leave you for this week, but if you want to get in touch, here's how to do it. You can send a tweet to me at Kamal AJE or our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali. If you're not on Twitter, the email is just fine. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And while you're online, head over to aljazeera.com/business. You link onto the CTC page. From there, we put all our episodes up on full for you to catch up on whenever you would like. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria with some time off coming up, so Taimur Nobili will be looking after you from next week. I hope you'll join him then. For now, though, from the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.